Let's talk about automations. Are an amazing way to run custom logic within your Zorp workflows. So there are multiple ways and multiple things you can do with automations, but let's first understand the basics. So ignore the entry point for now. I'll cover all of these things, but let's simply talk about the structure of automations. So if I create a new automation, these are the different options you can actually work with. So first is what we call a trigger. A trigger could be multiple things. A trigger is basically what triggers an automation to execute. So the trigger could be that the user is entering some text in one of the fields, or the user could be clicking on a button, or it could be an external event, or it could be that the screen is actually loading at the time I want to trigger an automation. There are so many different types that you can actually work with. So we will talk about the different types of triggers that are possible in the future videos. Second is what we call a validation. So validation is usually applicable in cases where you can decide whether you want to allow the trigger to proceed or not. For example, when the user clicks on a button to move to the next screen, you can apply a validation then and there to say whether the user is allowed to proceed to the next screen or not. Okay, and there you can have different kinds of validation. So one is what we call a location check. This is usually that the user is supposed to arrive at a location to do certain task, and the user is not. When the user says that I have arrived, you can take the user's location and the actual location they're supposed to be and see if it is close by, and only then let them proceed to the next step. So it has different options, including what is the source location, what is the destination location, and what is the allowed distance between the two. So one way of doing this is just use the logged in user's latitude and choose the logged in user's longitude. So this is the current user's location, and you can actually use something around data field where you have stored the location they're supposed to be in. Then if you say that they are supposed to be within 100 meters of these locations, then that check will apply when the user clicks on that button or does something, and you can decide to allow them to the next step or not. So these kind of validation can be placed, and that's where location check comes in. A different kind of validation is expression validation. Here you can run any kind of like if-else logic. If the data entered by this user is this, then proceed, otherwise do not proceed. So those kind of checks you can actually put in place. The last one is a REST API validation, which is you can make an API call to an external system, get the data, and based on the data, you can allow to let the user proceed to the next step, etc. This could be used in cases where you have OTP validations, or a user takes an image during attendance and the image has to match their profile. So a lot of these checks can be put in place. The third one, after the validation is done, is what we call an action block. So there could be multiple action blocks depending on what actions you want to run. Okay, so there is so let's say the action. We'll first talk about action, then we'll come to a condition. The action is basically what is that you want to perform. So what I want to perform could be that I want to send a push notification to the user. So I provide the title and the message, and I can it will automatically send a push notification. I can also update a different component. That means if I choose the option 1 in a radio button, you automatically show let's say a reason input box next, otherwise hide it. So these kind of manipulation within the screen is what app component update automation actually does, action automatically does. The third one is the REST API. So REST API is when the trigger happens, I want to call an external API. So we will talk about like the REST API and other configurations in detail, but it's a very simple way for you to integrate Zorp with any kind of external system. It could be third-party SaaS software, or it could be your own internal systems, could be any of these things. The last one is a JavaScript function, which is kind of like an open-ended coding interface where you can write your own custom logic. You want to write a script to validate some of the information that is entered, or whatever it is, you will be able to do all of those things using this particular function. Now let's come to conditions. So condition is basically the decision to allow the user to allow the action to run or not. For example, let's say there is a radio button. If I choose option 1, I want to call one API, and if there is option 2, I want to call a different API. So in those cases, I can apply a condition saying that if certain expression, if the value is equal to 1, then this will proceed. If the value is 2, this condition will fail and will move to the next section. Okay, and here you can have a condition saying that the value needs to be 2, then I'll run this particular action. So these kind of logic can be put in place, and you can have n number of action blocks this way. So this is the basics of how automation actually works. In the next video, we'll talk about the different types of automation, and then in the future videos we'll get into how to execute each of these different types of actions and with specific examples.